In 1893, in a farmhouse outside a town in Ohio, no one beyond the county line could place on a map. A rifle hangs on 2 iron pegs above a fireplace that has not been swept clean of last winter's ash. The man who put it there fought for 4 years and came home in 1865, and in the 28 years since he has said one thing about the rifle, more or less, that it is his. Not where it came from, not what it did. His grandson has asked twice, once at 8 years old and once at 11, and has learned by the second refusal not to ask a third. The reason the man cannot answer, or will not, sits inside a piece of paper the government printed in enormous numbers and that almost nobody bothered to keep. On the 30th of May, 1865, the War Department issued General Order Number 101, which allowed a discharged Union soldier to buy the weapon he had carried through the war and take it home a civilian, fully and legally his. There was a price list, short and specific. A musket of any pattern cost $6. A Spencer carbine cost $10. Any other carbine and any revolver cost $8. Hundreds of thousands of men signed for a printed slip, paid a clerk, and walked out of the mustering camp owning, for the first time, the rifle on their own shoulder. Hundreds of thousands of other guns went north in the very same rail cars with no paper behind them at all. Taken off the dead at Cold Harbor and Spotsylvania, taken from prisoners, taken out of houses in Georgia and the Carolinas by the foraging parties that marched with Sherman and were called, by the Army's own men, bummers. A gun bought for $6 and a gun taken off a body came home in the same knapsack, rode the same train, and hung, in the end, on the same nail. Only a receipt ever separated the two, and a receipt does not survive an Ohio winter 30 times over. 25 of those guns make up this list, arranged along the 3 roads that carried them north, bought under the order, taken on the field, carried out of a Southern house during the marches of 1864 and 1865. Hold the 3 roads in mind, because the same 3 explain nearly everything that follows. One item ahead carries a detail that gives away, without a word of confirmation needed, exactly where its owner served. Another was bought by the government, crated, and never handed to a single soldier for use in the war, which did not stop it from being shown off at reunions as though it had been. And the rifle at number 1, the plainest and most ordinary weapon of the entire war, sits at the top of this list for a simple reason. A receipt in a man's pocket did not loosen his tongue. Number 25, the Belgian contract musket. In the panic of 1861, with state arsenals bare and a war suddenly real, agents for the Union crossed the Atlantic and bought whatever European dealers still had crated in their warehouses. Tens of thousands of obsolete smoothbores and flintlocks, hastily altered to percussion, came out of Belgium that year. Arms no Continental Army wanted anymore. Cleared out at a price no honest dealer would have asked for a modern rifle. The men issued them in the field called them gas pipes, a name that stuck to the whole category and outlived any specific maker's mark on the barrel. Nobody bought a gas pipe for $6 under the order because nobody wanted one badly enough to pay for it. The ones that went north went home the plainest way of all, issued by a state that had no better weapon to give, unwanted at the depot once the war ended, and easier to carry home than to argue over with a quartermaster who wanted it back even less than the soldier wanted to keep it. That is closer to indifference than to shame. A shrug carried inside a barrel that misfired more often than it should have. Identifiable Belgian contract arms sell today for roughly $300 to $800, and the trade that handles them still uses the insult the soldiers coined a century and a half ago, printed now in auction catalogs instead of muttered in a trench. Number 24, the Austrian Lorenz rifle-musket. Austria's own standard infantry arm, a .54 caliber rifle musket, crossed the ocean in numbers that dwarfed almost every other import of the war, something well over 200,000 into Union hands alone. Quality varied by the batch and by the contractor who filled it. which meant one regiment swore by its Lorenz, while the next refused to carry one past. Its first bad extraction, and both opinions were correct depending entirely on which shipment a man happened to draw. Its trouble at home was never the rifle, it was the accent. A Lorenz looked foreign the moment it came off a soldier's shoulder, stamped with Austrian proof marks no Ohio farmer could read. And a family taking one down from a wall had no battle to attach it to and no regiment to name beside it. It explained nothing, which made it easy to set aside and hard to romanticize. A rifle needs a story before anyone bothers inventing one for it, and the Lorenz never got the chance. $800 to $2,000 is the going range today for an honest example with its import marks intact, priced less for what the rifle did in the war than for the plain fact that so many of them did something, somewhere, that nobody at home could ever place. Number 23, the Cosmopolitan Carbine. Built in Hamilton, Ohio, and named with more confidence than the design entirely earned, the Cosmopolitan was a breech-loading carbine with a distinctive curved operating lever and a reputation, fair or not, for coming apart under hard cavalry use. The government bought roughly 9,000 of them and sent most into the Western Theater, where Illinois and Missouri horsemen carried them through a war that looked nothing like the one being fought in Virginia at the same time. A cavalryman who survived 4 years of raids, ambush, and open country in the West was not a man inclined to hand his carbine back to a quartermaster who barely wanted it returned either. $8 under the order settled the matter cleanly, and the Cosmopolitan rode north in a saddle scabbard rather than a knapsack. One more small difference between a Western trooper's homecoming and an infantryman's. Few survived intact, since the design's own weaknesses did in storage what 40 years usually cannot. And an example in genuine working order now brings roughly $1,500 to $3,000, collected as much for its scarcity as for the horsemen who carried it through a war fought largely without an audience back home. Number 22, the Gwynn and Campbell Carbine. The same Hamilton works that had built the Cosmopolitan reworked the design into a sturdier successor, and the government bought roughly 8,000 of them under a name the troops never bothered using. They called it the Grapevine Carbine and left it at that. It armed cavalry across Missouri and Arkansas in a war that rarely resembled the campaigns fought further east, and its reputation traveled with the men who carried it into that different fight. The distinction matters more than the mechanism ever did. A soldier who fought in Virginia had Antietam or the Wilderness to name when someone finally asked. A soldier who fought the Grapevine War in Missouri had raids on former neighbors, reprisals against men he had grown up beside, and burned farms belonging to people whose names he still knew. That was not a war described comfortably at a dinner table in 1870, whatever gun had done the describing, and the carbine came home carrying that same reluctance to talk about any of it. Original condition examples today run from roughly $1,200 to $2,500, a modest sum for a carbine that carried one of the ugliest chapters of the entire war, and said nothing about it afterward. Number 21, the Lindner Carbine. Edward Lindner patented a breech-loading carbine built around a rotating collar that lifted the whole breech assembly clear for loading. An elegant solution the Ordnance Department bought in only modest numbers, issued mainly to cavalry regiments across 1862 and 1863. It never approached the volume of the more common carbines on this list, and that scarcity shapes nearly everything about how it survived into the present. A gun purchased by the 1,000 belongs, in a sense, to a regiment, a campaign, a general story a family could retell and outline even after the specifics had faded from memory. A Lindner belongs to one man. Small purchase numbers mean a northern attic holding one almost certainly kept it because of a single soldier in a single unit, and its silence, where it exists at all, is personal rather than the broad institutional hush that covers the more common arms. A private matter rather than a category problem shared across a whole generation. Surviving Lindners are genuinely scarce today, bringing $2,000 and climbing from there, priced less on condition than on the simple fact that so few were made to begin with. Not every carbine on this list stayed small in number, And not every reason for keeping quiet stayed personal? What changes with scale is the shape of the silence. A war fought partly at sea, a war fought too strangely to explain over supper, a war fought so close to home that a man might rather not describe exactly where he had spent it. Number 20, the Warner Carbine. Manufactured in Massachusetts with a brass frame around a breech-loading action that was, by most cavalry accounts, awkward to extract once fouled, the Warner was purchased in the low thousands and issued largely to Wisconsin cavalry regiments. It was never among the more admired carbines of the war, and few troopers who carried one through a hard campaign came away especially impressed with the mechanism underneath the brass ages differently than iron, and that accident of metallurgy did more for the Warner's survival than any trooper's opinion of it ever could. A brass-framed carbine kept its color and its shape through decades that turned iron parts to rust, which is why families who otherwise hid Civil War weapons away in trunks and attics were willing to hang a Warner on a wall in plain sight. It looked, even 50 years on, like something worth looking at. A brass example in honest condition brings roughly $1,800 to $3,500 today, valued now for the same gleam that once turned a mediocre carbine into a mantelpiece. Number 19, the Green Carbine. Ordered by the government as early as 1857, the Green was the first true bolt-action arm the United States ever purchased. An underhammer design with the firing mechanism slung beneath the stock, and a bore, rifled with an unusual oval Lancaster twist instead of conventional grooves. It was already an oddity before the war started, and 4 years of hard use did nothing to make it more familiar to the men who were issued it. Strangeness, in this one case, is what preserved it. A weapon soldiers distrusted and rarely fired is a weapon that does not wear itself out, and green carbines survived the war disproportionately well, simply because so few of the men carrying them cared to test the mechanism twice. What came home was often close to what had originally been issued, unbroken not from careful treatment, but from plain neglect, the gun keeping its own kind of secret before the soldier ever added his to it. $2,500 to $5,000 is roughly what a complete green commands today, priced for its rarity in the history of American ordnance, rather than for any battlefield record it never had much chance to build. Number 18, the Perry Carbine. Designed before the war in Newark, New Jersey, the Perry Carbine loaded percussion caps automatically from a magazine built into the buttstock, a self-priming idea that was, by most estimates, a generation ahead of the machining meant to make it reliable. The government bought only a small number, and both Army and Navy units carried them in modest quantities through the early years of the fighting. The Navy connection is the detail that shapes this carbine's homecoming. Sailors mustered out in port cities rather than in the home counties that received most Army regiments, and a weapon that came off a gunboat on the Mississippi or the Carolina coast traveled home through a boarding house and a train ticket bought with a sailor's own pay, not through the mustering out ceremony of a regiment marching together into a courthouse square. It is one of the few guns on this list whose road north bypassed the order's own logic and spirit, even where it followed the letter of it. Perry carbines sell today from roughly $3,000 upward, more with the priming mechanism still functioning after a century and a half of rust and neglect. Number 17, the Palmer Bolt Action Carbine. William Palmer's design became the first metallic cartridge bolt-action weapon the United States government ever purchased, an order of 1,000 delivered in June of 1865. After Lee had surrendered, after Johnston had surrendered, after the fighting the carbine was meant to join had already ended weeks earlier. It stands as the strangest acquisition story on this entire list, a weapon manufactured for a war that no longer needed it, by the time it arrived. Nearly the whole order went almost immediately into surplus, and from there into the hands of men who had never fired one at anyone, and were under no particular obligation to say so afterward. A veteran handed a carbine at muster-out did not always volunteer the manufacturing date stamped into the receiver, and few visitors thought to ask a man who had clearly served whether his weapon had actually served alongside him. The gun looked to any eye in a farmhouse parlor like every other veteran's carbine. It simply was not. A Palmer today brings roughly $2,000 to $4,000, valued precisely for the peculiar timing that turns an ordinary-looking carbine into a small, historical joke nobody at the time found funny in the least. Number 16, the Triplet and Scott Carbine. A repeating carbine built in Meriden, Connecticut, with a tube magazine fitted into the buttstock, and a mechanism worked by rotating the barrel and receiver a half turn. Roughly 5,000 were built for a single, narrow purpose, arming Kentucky's home guard, so the state's railroads could be protected, while its regular regiments went south to fight the war proper. It was never intended for the main armies at all. Home Guard service was the most awkward war record a Union veteran from a border state could carry into the rest of his life. It sat close enough to the actual fighting to be dangerous, and far enough from it to be sneered at by men who had gone south themselves. And a Triplet and Scott hanging over a Kentucky mantle raised exactly the question its owner least enjoyed answering. Not what did you see, but where were you really, and for how long? Good condition still commands roughly $2,000 to $4,000 today, a solid price for a carbine whose real difficulty was never the mechanism, but the service record that came permanently attached to it. The Home Guard carbine raised a question about where a man had served. The carbines and revolvers that follow raise a different question. Not where, but whose. Some changed hands honestly, at $8 under the order. Others changed hands the moment a body hit the ground, and ownership blurred the instant that happened. Number 15. The Jocelyn Carbine. A metallic cartridge breech loader with a breech block that swung open on a side hinge, the Jocelyn was purchased in quantity late in the war, something over 11,000 delivered and issued to cavalry through 1864 and into 1865. It was, by the standards of this list, an ordinary and common weapon, one of the more widely carried late-war carbines rather than any kind of rarity. Common is exactly the point. A Jocelyn was likely to have been bought honestly for $8 under the order, likely to be the actual weapon its owner had carried through his actual service, and therefore one of the few guns on this list a family could discuss without running headlong into the category problem that swallowed so many of the others. That plain honesty may be why more Jocelyn's survive in the open today, displayed rather than buried in a trunk. Nothing about owning one required an explanation nobody particularly wanted to give. A Jocelyn carbine today sells for roughly $1,500 to $3,000, an unremarkable price for an unremarkable gun, which in the context of this list is itself worth pausing on. Number 14, the Sharps and Hankins Navy Carbine. The Sharps and Hankins was a short breech loader in which the entire barrel slides forward to load, bought by the Navy in the early years of the war and fitted on its naval pattern, with a heavy leather sleeve wrapped over the barrel to keep salt spray off the metal. A feature no carbine issued to a land regiment ever needed or received. That leather is the detail promised earlier on this list, and it identifies its owner as precisely as any regimental number stamped into a stock ever could. A man who came home with a Sharps and Hankins in its leather jacket had served afloat, on blockade duty off the Carolina coast, or aboard the river gunboats that fought their own separate war, and the sleeve on the barrel said so before he ever opened his mouth about it. Many surviving examples still wear it, kept oiled and supple by hands that went on tending the leather for decades after the reason for tending it had stopped mattering. A Navy model with its original leather intact today brings roughly $3,000 to $6,000, and a stripped example, the leather long gone, sells for considerably less. the covering worth nearly as much as the carbine it once protected. Number 13, the Bacon revolver. Made in Norwich, Connecticut, by a firm working the edges of the government's larger contracts rather than inside them, the Bacon was a modest percussion revolver sold privately to officers who wanted their own sidearm and to soldiers who simply wanted a second gun beyond whatever the Army had issued them. No order number attaches to it because none was ever needed for a purchase like this one. A privately bought Bacon is among the cleanest guns on this entire list in one narrow sense. It was never government property, required no receipt from any quartermaster, and carried no category problem for a family to inherit along with the gun itself. And yet these are consistently the revolver's descendants report finding not hung on a wall, but folded into a trunk beside the discharge papers, which suggests that what kept a family from talking about a Civil War weapon was never only a question of how honestly it had been acquired. Bacon revolvers sell today from roughly $500 to $1,200, a modest figure for a modest gun that, alone among the 25 on this list, came with an entirely uncomplicated bill of sale. Number 12, the Metropolitan Navy revolver. When Colt's own armory in Hartford burned in February of 1864, a New York firm stepped into the resulting gap in supply with a close copy of Colt's Navy pattern, producing roughly 6,000 revolvers built to nearly the same lines, and often mistaken, then and since, for the original. They were built to imitate. A copy carries its own particular kind of doubt. A man who came home with a Metropolitan and allowed his family to believe, or simply never bothered to correct the assumption, that it was a genuine Colt was not exactly lying to them. He may not have known the difference himself in an era before anyone thought to check a maker's mark against a reference book. The market has spent a century and a half sorting out that same confusion, one estate sale at a time, with no end to the sorting in sight. Metropolitan Navy. Revolvers bring roughly $1,500 to $3,500 today, priced somewhat below the Colt they were built to resemble, and no small number of them are still being sold, without comment, as something they were never quite meant to be. Number 11, the Plant's Army revolver. Built in New Haven around a cup-primed cartridge that loaded from the front of the cylinder rather than the rear, the Plant's Army existed mainly to sidestep the Rollin White patent that had locked most American manufacturers out of the standard bored-through cylinder design entirely. It was clever, it worked well enough, and it depended entirely on ammunition only a handful of firms ever bothered to make. That ammunition vanished from the market within a decade of the war's end, and the consequence still shows up in attics today. A Plant's revolver found now is very often fully loaded, because the veteran who carried it home had nowhere left to buy more cartridges once his own supply ran out, and rather than leave the weapon empty, he simply put it away exactly as it was. It has waited, loaded, through 5 or 6 generations of a family that never once opened the cylinder to check. Examples sell today for roughly $800 to $2,000, and any given one, any get in mind, a fact worth remembering before handling it, may still be carrying its original charge. Not every gun that reached a northern parlor reached it during the war at all. Some arrived only after the fact, sold off as surplus to men who had never carried them in anger. And the families who received them were very often the last to learn the difference. Number 10, the Freeman Army revolver. Manufactured at Hord's Armory in Watertown, New York, the Freeman was a heavy .44 caliber percussion revolver with a cylinder arrangement that let the whole cylinder be withdrawn in a single motion. Roughly 2,000 made and most of them sold, not during the fighting but afterward, once the war no longer had any use for them. That timing is the entire story of this revolver. A great many Freemans reached veterans through surplus dealers in the late 1860s, years after Appomattox, which means some of the guns hanging in northern parlors as war relics never actually saw the war at all. bought secondhand by a man who simply wanted a good revolver and happened to like the look of one that had, technically, missed the fighting entirely. Families believed otherwise for a full century, and nothing in the gun itself was ever going to correct them. Today, a Freeman goes for roughly $2,000 to $4,000, sold now with the same ambiguity it has always carried, since no mark on the metal says whether a given example fired a shot in anger or arrived home in a crate a full 3 years late. Number 9, the Butterfield revolver. A Philadelphia-made percussion revolver fed by a disc primer set into the front of the frame, the Butterfield was ordered in the low thousands by the government and rejected almost as quickly, with only a few hundred actually delivered before the contract was canceled outright. Fewer still survive with their original loading lever intact, since the disc primer mechanism proved as fragile in private hands as it had in government testing. A canceled contract does one thing reliably. It puts the surviving guns straight onto the private market. And officers with their own money bought Butterfields directly rather than wait on an army that had already told the design no. That makes the Butterfield one of the small number of weapons on this list whose owner, if ever asked, could have answered the question honestly without any difficulty and simply chose, like most of the others, not to. Butterfields are rare enough today to bring $3,000 to $7,000, a price built almost entirely on how few of them the government ever actually accepted in the first place. Number 8, the Joslin Army revolver. Not to be confused with the carbine of the same name, the Joslin Army was a .44 caliber percussion revolver, several thousand delivered to the government early in the war, and issued to cavalry units well before the later carbine had even been designed. Early issue meant early exposure, and the men who carried a Joslin revolver into 1862 had a poor chance of carrying it back out again. A great many of them went north instead in a dead man's effects, packed by a friend or an officer, and mailed home with a short letter that said more than any family ever repeated afterward. Of every road a gun took north on this list, the mail is the quietest one. No order, no field, no march through Georgia, only an envelope and a box that arrived one ordinary afternoon and changed a house permanently. Joslin revolvers sell today for roughly $2,000 to $4,000, worth exactly as much as any comparable percussion revolver, and carrying, in an unknown number of cases, considerably more than that. Number 7, the Pettengill hammerless revolver. Built with its hammer enclosed entirely inside the frame, a double-action-only percussion design, the Pettengill was ordered by the thousand in 1862, and then largely condemned once testing found the mechanism unreliable under field conditions, a verdict the government reached, and then, in practice, mostly ignored anyway. The condemned revolvers went out to cavalry regiments regardless, because a war does not wait for a better answer, and the men who were issued one and survived carried, for the rest of the conflict, a weapon the Army's own testers had already decided was defective. That is not a fact that improves anyone's appetite for telling stories about it afterward. Not shame, not violence. Just an unwillingness to describe carrying a gun one's own government had already given up on. Pettengills bring roughly $2,500 to $5,000 today, valued for their rarity rather than their reliability. Exactly the reversal the design earned in its own lifetime. Number 6, the Rogers and Spencer Army revolver. Manufactured in Willowvale, New York, the Rogers and Spencer was a well-made .44 caliber percussion revolver, 5,000 delivered against a government contract that was not completed until the autumn of 1865, months after Lee's surrender, after Johnston's, after the last organized Confederate resistance east of the Mississippi had already given out. This is the revolver promised earlier on this list. The entire delivery was accepted, paid for, crated, and placed into storage without a single unit ever receiving one for actual use. And there it sat until it was finally sold off as surplus decades later. A Rogers and Spencer in a veteran's house, in other words, did not come from his war at all. Whatever the man himself allowed his family to believe when he hung it on the wall, beside the things he had genuinely carried. Some of them clearly knew the difference and said nothing about it. Others may honestly not have known, because so many survived unfired in their original crated storage. Rogers and Spencer revolvers in fine condition now sell for roughly $1,500 to $4,000, and the rare mint examples, still carrying the sheen of a war they never actually joined, bring considerably more. Some guns on this list hid in plain sight. The ones left are the opposite. Common enough to be certain, unmistakable enough to draw a question from every visitor who ever saw one, and in the case of the very last, so ordinary that nothing was left to hide behind at all. Number 5. The Savage Navy Revolver. Built around a second ring-shaped lever mounted below the trigger guard, which gave its frame a figure-8 outline no other American revolver of the war shared, the Savage Navy was a .36 caliber percussion design purchased in quantity, roughly 20,000 bought by the government and issued to cavalry regiments and to the Navy alike. Its silhouette is the whole point. A man could tuck a plain revolver into a drawer and nobody in the house thought twice about it, but a Savage hung on a wall drew a question from every single visitor who noticed that unmistakable double lever, and a veteran who chose to display one had already decided, well before the first question ever came, exactly how much of an answer he was willing to give. Some gave a little. Most gave rather less. Clear inspector marks still legible on the frame at a premium today. The same details a veteran once had to account for out loud to a curious neighbor. Savage Navy revolvers bring roughly $1,200 to $3,000 now. More for the best marked examples. Number 4. The Remington Model 1863 contract rifle. Known to the troops as the Zouave, this two-band rifle in .58 caliber was built under contract in quantities of roughly 12,000, finished with brass fittings, and a polished no government arsenal of the period was producing on its own arms. It looked, by every account that survives, better than a soldier's working rifle had any right to look. It is also the great open question of Civil War arms collecting. The surviving examples are in such uniformly fine condition that historians have argued for decades over whether the pattern was ever actually issued to troops in the field at all, or whether most of the contract went straight into reserve and simply stayed there until the war ended around it, which means a veteran who came home with a Remington Zouave may have come home with a rifle that, however handsome, never fired a single shot at anyone, a possibility neither he nor his family ever had any real way of settling. A market that decades of reproductions have done nothing to simplify now prices an original Zouave at roughly $2,500 to $6,000. Number 3, the Colt Special Model 1861 rifle-musket. Colt's own contract version of the standard infantry rifle musket, roughly 100,000 delivered, was built with parts interchangeable enough that the government eventually told other contractors to copy Colt's own pattern rather than the arsenal's original. It was, in every practical sense that mattered to the man carrying it, the same rifle the arsenals were producing, made instead by a private firm under license. That sameness is the entire subject of this list, standing for once inside a single object. A soldier could carry a Colt Special home in 1865, and no one, not his family, not a historian since, not even a careful appraiser today, could tell at a glance whether it had been bought honestly for $6 under the order or picked up off a field at Gettysburg or Antietam instead. The rifle itself simply refuses to answer the only question anyone has ever put to it. An original Colt Special Model today sells for roughly $2,000 to $4,500, priced the same whichever of the two roads it actually happened to travel north on. Number 2, the Colt Model 1861 Navy Revolver. A streamlined 36 caliber revolver with a creeping loading lever and a round barrel. Roughly 38,000 were made and bought overwhelmingly by officers who wanted a sidearm handsomer than anything the Ordnance Department issued for free. On paper, an officer's private purchase is the cleanest kind of ownership on this entire list, except that a striking number of these revolvers reached Union hands not through a northern gunsmith, but through the collapse itself, from the surrender at Appomattox in April of 1865, and from the parallel collapse in the Carolinas that same month, when Confederate officers were permitted under the terms to keep their personal sidearms, and then, in fairly short order, found reasons to part with them anyway, sold or traded, or simply handed over to a Union officer who happened to be standing nearby at the time. Every one of those transfers is a story a man could tell one way at his club and a considerably different way at his own dinner table. Prices today run roughly $2,500 to $7,000 for a Colt Model 1861 Navy, and an identified officer's revolver, name, and unit still attached brings considerably more than that. Number 1. The Springfield Model 1863 rifle-musket. The most produced American shoulder arm of the entire war after its own immediate predecessor, roughly 700,000 were made at the Springfield Armory in two successive types between 1863 and 1865. It was the rifle in the hands of most Union infantrymen by the war's final year, the culmination of a pattern the Armory had been steadily refining since before the fighting ever started. This is the $6 rifle. Under General Order Number 101, a discharged soldier could buy the very weapon he had carried, and enormous numbers of them did exactly that. Walking out of the mustering camp with a printed receipt folded into a coat pocket and the rifle itself over a shoulder, entitled to both beyond any legal question whatsoever. And it sits at number 1 for exactly that reason. Entitlement did not produce speech. A receipt is paper, and paper does not survive 30 Ohio winters, and by 1893, the rifle over a farmhouse fireplace looked exactly like the one a neighbor down the road had taken off a body at Antietam, and neither family could prove which was which, so both men said nothing. Their sons learned not to ask twice. And the rifles outlived the answer, hanging on their pegs long after anyone still living could have supplied one. An original Model 1863 in honest condition sells today for roughly $1,500 to $4,000, and one that still comes with its original purchase receipt is worth a multiple of that figure. The paper, after a century and a half, now rarer than the rifle it once accompanied. Hundreds of thousands of these rifles and revolvers are still in northern houses, in gun cabinets and attic trunks, and here and there, still on the 2 pegs above a fireplace where a family first hung one. The overwhelming majority of them carry no paper, no regiment, and no name. Not because a soldier ever destroyed the evidence, but because the evidence was a printed slip that nobody, in the ordinary business of raising children and paying a mortgage and burying parents, thought worth keeping for 40 years. A receipt from the order never made a man honest. A man could buy his own rifle for $6 and still have taken 3 others off a field the same week, and the $6 slip in his pocket said nothing at all about the rest of what came home with him. What the paper did was make a gun legible, attachable to a name, a date, a unit, a price. Legibility, not honesty, turned out to be the entire difference between a relic a family could describe and a rifle a family could only keep. The Ohio farmhouse is still there, or a house enough like it that the difference hardly matters anymore. The rifle still hangs over the fireplace, the stock darkened in one particular place, where a hand rested on it through 40 winters of being taken down, looked at, and put back without comment. The grandson who learned as a boy not to ask a second time is an old man himself now, has been for years, and has never once asked a third. Nobody ever told him not to. He simply understands, the way the whole century came to understand, that some questions outlive the men who could have answered them, and the rifle keeps hanging exactly where it has always hung, saying nothing, the way it was taught to from the very first year it went up on the wall.